High on praise and exaltation, we are Hope 103.1 FM. Hope 103.1 FM, reaching our nation for God.
We are a chosen generation, called to show His excellence. All I require for life, God has given me. I know who I am.
Wonderful Wednesday afternoon.
We are a chosen
To each and every one of you,
generation,
locked on to Hope 103.1 FM.
His excellence.
Today is Wednesday, the 18th of May, 2022.
God has given me. I know who I am. I know who God says I am.
And we know what time it is. It's time for Leadership Plus.
I know who I am. I know who God says I am.
And we are joined by none other than Reverend John Lewis, Director of GITE. He's a trained Maxwell coach, leadership coach that is. And for the past 11 months, about 3 weeks, he has been here on Leadership Plus. My hope is that we've all grown over these past 11 months, yeah? This is your host, Precious Lady Abby. Blessed afternoon to you, Reverend John. How are you today?
Good evening. It's good to be back on this Wednesday evening. We missed you guys last week, but we trust that you're back with us today and to be able to continue our discussion on a very important topic again this week, the art of the basin and the towel, developing the qualities of leadership.
Yes. And before we jump into today's discussion, you know, I was looking into our archives, and I think I've counted about 37 sessions we've had here in Leadership Plus. We have been talking some very great topics. I mean, I remember a few of them: the hidden value, rookie smart, the inner circle, and most recently the 5-step of leadership. And we have been talking some very, very, very pertinent information or topics that must and should help a person that has been paying keen attention. How has the journey been for you this past 11 months, Reverend John, here on Leadership Plus?
Well, it's been an exciting journey and the privilege to have this platform to communicate these principles of leadership and management. Of course, they're based in biblical principles, as we said in one of our programs that was held on advanced leadership. All the principles of leadership and management, if we take a serious look and research, they're all biblically based. Management, we see that in the life of Nehemiah, and leadership, we see that in the life of Moses, we see that in the life of Joshua, and other great men and women. When we see these principles exemplified in their lives. And so when we read other books on leadership principles and management, for the most part, those where those principles come from. I remember one of the books that we delved into was Peter Drucker's book.
Yes.
You know, biblically based in what are the 5 most important questions you will ever ask of your organization? And so they are writers from the field of leadership, and many writers. I'm sure there are thousands and thousands of books and articles written on our primary focus this evening, of course, is on servant leadership. Now, servant leadership has become a very prevalent word, not only in the Christian community, but also in the business community as well. And it's an interesting discussion, even in our national context, even as we look forward to a general election here in Grenada. The whole concept of what it means to be a leader, a servant leader from a biblical perspective.
Right. These are very important points that any leader should pay attention to. I remember the very first program, I was a bit nervous, but then when we got into the information, it was so interesting. That nervousness disappeared. And today we're going to have another important topic, as you would have already mentioned, the art of the basin and towel. The art of the basin and the towel. And we're not talking about going to bake or put together a recipe with that basin and towel. It's quite something more important. And as you mentioned, as I said, we're talking about developing the qualities of a servant leader. And while I was reading the piece for today, it just stood out to me, this the first sentence. It says, the issue of servant leadership is the single greatest contrast between the spiritual and secular leadership. You know, and that stood out to me, that servant leadership and spiritual leadership has a great contrast. Servant leadership. Take us deeper into that.
Great, as you quoted from the passage there, but one of the books that we've also read is called In the Name of Jesus by Henry Nouwen. And Henry Nouwen is very reflective in his writing and very in-depth in terms of to be a servant leader. And he highlights 3 temptations that leaders are faced with. And even some of these correspond to the 3 temptations of Jesus. The first temptation, of course, that he faced was to be self-sufficient. As you know, the temptation, of course, if you are the Son of God, you make bread out of stone. You take these stones and make bread. And so it was a temptation to be self-reliant. And sometimes that's where leaders struggle in terms of where they find their strength from, where their strength of leadership is located, is not in themselves, but rather it's a reliance upon God and upon Christ and His Spirit that gives us the wisdom in leading, and how also to identify the subtle temptations that may come our way. Temptations to prove ourselves, as it were, to show others how good we are, how we may be even better than them, a sense of where we are. The idea is that the notion gets to our head of our self-importance. And with Jesus Christ, of course, rejected that temptation, self-reliance. And then the second temptation, as we know, was that to be spectacular. It's the concept of being a celebrity. He tempted him, if he was God, he could throw himself down from the mountain. And he wanted Jesus to prove to be, in our context, a stunt, just flip and drop anywhere and he will not hurt himself. But the goal of leadership is not to become a celebrity or to maintain an image, but rather to obey God. And that's what Christ modeled for us. The essence of being a servant is not necessarily being spectacular or being a celebrity. And the third one, of course, is to become powerful. His temptation was that bow down, worship him, and he even used scripture to entice Christ himself. How much more we as leaders in today's times may be tempted to prove our power, to prove our influence among those that we seek to serve. To lead is appropriate and necessary, but to push manipulate and control is never right. Put simply, one God is sufficient. We don't need to be little gods in our own eyes, but rather see the omnipotent, all ever present, all powerful God. And so these were the three temptations, and that was reflected in the life of Christ, but also in our current times in which we live. Leaders will face these temptations in similar way, not necessarily turning stone into bread, not necessarily jumping off a mountain or to become powerful in our own way. So there is a difference between what is called horizontal thinking and vertical thinking. So instead of looking up to God, we look at each other, or we look around and compare ourselves with what others are doing. So those are some of the concerns. It's going to be practicing the art of the basin and towel. Of course, the context of this discussion today, chapter 13, 1 to 20. You remember the story of how Christ took a basin of water and a towel and he washed. Christ-like servant leaders, one, they are motivated by love to serve others. Before the Passover, he came and he demonstrated what servant leadership was. So Jesus' love was demonstrating his involvement with others. He was involved with those around him. There was not a distance between him and his followers, as it was a continuous sense of leadership. It was unconditional love, unselfish love that motivated Christ. And how much more we should be characterized by these principles if we are going to be like real servant leaders, unselfish, demonstrated unconditional love and continuous love for one. Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. That's a quote from the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Everyone can be great. You only need to have a heart full of grace. So that's a challenge for all of us. So the principles and the practices that we need to live out in our lives is we are motivated primarily by the value of loving others. And then secondly, we possess a security that allows them to minister to others. So when leaders are insecure in themselves, they really are not able to lead in a servant spirited way.
Right.
Leaders who are insecure in themselves tend to be self-sufficient and they take the stance of self-reliance and the picture of a celebrity. But in this example that we have, Jesus knew his position and was willing not to flaunt it. If Christ could have done any of those things that Satan tempted him to do, of course, he could have turned the bones into bread. He could have jumped off this high mountain, the Mount of Temptation, and he could have done any of those, but that would have just proven self-reliance rather than God reliance. So he knew his position and he knew his calling and was willing to be faithful to it. So we need to always go back and identify what we have been called to do. Each person has been given the gift and a particular call. And as we indicated elsewhere and in these discussions as well, identifying your call is so important so that we're not wasting our life, as it were, so that we accentuate, we remain focused in terms of the calling to which we have been assigned. And Jesus knew his future and was willing to submit to it. Of course, Jesus Christ knew that ultimately he was going to die on a cross. And and in spite of all the temptation to be spectacular and to be powerful and to be self-reliant, submitted himself to his Father's calling, his Father's will. I am come to do the will of my Father, says Christ. So he was secure as a leader, and when we are secure in the sense of our calling, understanding God's program and future for what is ahead of us, it enables us to be secure in our role and our responsibility as being called by God.
Yes, I think it was Miles Monroe that made a quote. I may be paraphrasing, but essentially what he said, one of the tragedies of life is to live a life where you've not fulfilled the right purpose. And so some people succeed, but they succeed at the wrong thing in life. And here I'm just, we're reminded that Jesus was focused. He knew his purpose. He understood it. And so fame and these other things did not really shock him or interest him, so to speak. He knew his purpose. He was faithful to it, and he would not flaunt his power and all the other things you just mentioned there. Could you continue taking us to this third point on
Sure.
security?
So servanthood begins with security.
Yeah.
And so the question is, are you secure enough to serve people without regard to your position? As we mentioned last time we were here, the 5 levels of leadership. And the lowest level of leadership is that of position, of your title. And so when our leadership role is founded on that level of leadership, we are not in a place where we can be involved in a very effective way. So thirdly, initiate servant ministry to others. So he got up from the table, set aside his robe, put on apron, then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with his apron. So he took initiative to do that, of course, and that's the whole concept of what it means to be a true servant. Usually we wait on others to do those kinds of function, perform those kind of um, tasks that we consider to be below us or menial tasks, as we would say, someone's feet. Or, but so we as servant leaders initiate. We take the right to lead. So do you initiate acts of service to those under you? So as a leader, the role and responsibility is to initiate, to be proactive. And you're not wait on to be served, but rather you are serving others. And that's sometimes totally opposed to the view of leadership, to some views of leadership, where the leader, the boss, the manager, bishop, priest, sometimes assume the role that that's not my function. Not my function to do those kinds of things. But do you initiate acts of service to those under you? For in the attitude of Christ, he had nothing to prove. He had nothing to lose. He had nothing to hide. So he made himself vulnerable. And sometimes we are not willing to do that in terms of our role and function. And sorry, number 4, receive servant ministry from others. So it's not only to others, but also receiving it from others. Peter was still position conscious at this point. That's why he couldn't receive from Jesus.
Okay.
So it is not only giving, but also receiving as well. Do you have too much pride to receive servant ministry from others? Very often you may be offered services that people want to render to you. And we sometimes refuse, we reject those offers to be served. And when we examine the motivation of behind those responses to others who want to serve us, is basically one of pride.
Mm.
And we sometimes do not quite get the point that we are to receive ministry from others. Do you have too much pride to receive servant ministry from others? When people offer you a cup of water, a glass of water, a drink, um, offer to serve you in any way, what's your response to them as well? And then number 5, so there has to be a willingness not only to give servant leadership, but to receive servant ministry from others. Want nothing to interfere with their relation with Jesus. And Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you can't be part of what I'm doing. Peter moves from one extreme to the other. Then, of course, he has to be washed completely. Do you hunger for intimacy with God so much that you'll do anything to get it? It has to do with your relationship with Christ. Hungering for intimacy with God. Because that's the starting point for servant leadership. If we are not truly connected to the source of the power of Christ, or who demonstrates this example of servanthood and servant leadership, we can easily lose our way. It is the illustration we find in John 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you don't abide in me, you cannot function. And so we have to be connected to the source of the true servant, who demonstrated his true servanthood and true steward. So do you hunger for that kind of relationship with the ideal servant who was prophesied in the book of Isaiah? Behold, my servant, he will come and he will be a sacrifice, in the book of Isaiah. And then number 6, teach servanthood by their example. After he had finished washing their feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and went back to his place at the table. And he said, do you understand what I have done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. This is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, wash your feet, then you must now wash feet. I've laid a pattern for you. So as we would say, he led by his example.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, example is one of the greatest teacher.
Mm-hmm.
When, for example, parents tell children to do particular things, they're very observant, look at what we do. And so they observe your practices, your examples of honesty, integrity, and those kinds of values. So people do what people see, principle. People do not necessarily what you tell them, or what you proclaim, or what you shout about and make a lot of noise about, but rather people do people see. So some observations then. Servants don't gain rights as they surrender them. So servant leadership rises, the servant leader rises to the highest level of leadership, but they do not hold on to those. They surrender them. everyone wants to be thought of as a servant, but no one wants to be treated like one.
True.
That's an interesting point. We
Mm,
want to be thought of in a particular way, but we don't want to be treated uh, as such.
mm,
We would all love to wash Jesus' feet, but we're commanded to wash each other's feet. Of course, if you had the privilege to wash Jesus' feet, everybody would rush for that responsibility. But when you have to wash some real dirty feet, I don't think we jump up and get excited. I recall we were in service, and one of the men that I had the privilege to be to wash, apparently he was a farmer, and I don't even think he wore shoes. So he would have come through some muddy paths before coming to this service. I mean, there was just so much mud, and it
mm,
took at that time it took like forever
mm.
to get rid of all that
Yeah,
dirt. But that's an example how we serve others.
yeah.
But it's not only in term that is an example of what was done, but it may not necessarily have to be literally washing others' feet. We do not really. Some churches may have a practice still, but it's not prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a principle.
Yeah.
It is a principle now that really matters. What it is for you in your context to wash somebody else's feet, maybe taking care of somebody's
Yeah.
um, else in terms of a child that needs help to go to school or that needs clothing or food or provisions for livelihood, maybe a co-worker that needs that servant leadership to demonstrate to them
Mm-hmm.
that you're not above them, but that you want to serve them, serving them by sharing a meal with them, sharing what you have, and sharing with them words of hope and light and encouragement. How do we serve people uh, in times in which we live? And we live in a time when there's a lot of hopelessness. There is a cry about how people are going to manage, how people are going to make it. Um, and how do you respond as a servant leader to those situation and circumstance in your home? How do you serve one another in the homes in which we live? Our family, our children, our elderly, those who may not be well, the sick people. And then in the case where we are working, how do we treat our fellow employees or even employees? Demonstrate to them what it means to be a good servant leader. So, are we modeling what it means to surrender your rights as a leader? Uh, you may feel that you have the right to overpower others, to show how great or how influential you are. Um, that's not the point of this discussion. It's really how do you give up your rights in order to help others
Mm-hmm.
who may be less than what you have positioned to do. And number seven, live a blessed life. When we do what I've done, we do. I have only pointed out the obvious. A servant is not ranked above his master. An employee doesn't give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm talking to you about, act like it and have a blessed life. So how do you demonstrate that in your personal life, in your activity, in the church community? How do we live a life that is blessed by God because you are not ranked above the role of the master in this context, Christ himself. So the point is that if Christ was willing to make that model of leadership, servant leadership, how much more are we challenged today to fulfill this role if we associate ourselves as a follower of Christ. And the work and challenges go against the grain of the contemporary cultures in which we live and work, where you boss around people if you're the boss, where you shout down at people, and where you, as we say, throw your weight around. But rather, it is demonstrated an example of true servant.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if you're now joining us, we are discussing about servant leadership today. And our topic is the art of the basin and the towel. And we are looking at servant leadership and more so Jesus type of leadership, where he became a servant, he became a servant to those around him. And he didn't act in the secular way, because I believe the people in the Bible time and so forth, when Jesus came, would have seen a lot of the secular type of leadership. And when Jesus came, he did things completely opposite. He became a servant leadership. Who would have, liked to see Herod washing somebody's feet? When you read about Herod and you read about these great emperors, nowhere you would have found them a king washing a servant's feet. Oh no. But the King of Kings and the greatest Lord of Lords, he came and demonstrated a different type of leadership that is called, as we have been saying for the past 45 minutes or so, servant leadership. And that's a type of leadership that we encourage in the kingdom of God, not like secular worship leadership where you do top-down type of attitude and mentality. No, you must, as we have, Reverend John has pointed out, be aware of the temptations that are there, be aware of them. And then we looked at, being secure in who you are as a person, being persuaded of your calling, knowing who and whose you are, and the purpose that you came, and doing that with excellence as unto the Lord. We're going on to point, we were speaking about how do we live a blessed life. And we were looking at the Beatitudes. So you want to continue with that, Reverend John?
Exactly. So you're blessed when you're with less of you, there is more of God and His rule. So when we recognize that we cannot serve in this role in our own strength and our own capabilities, we come back to the starting point where we rely upon God. And you're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's a moment you find yourself proud owners of everything that can't be bought. So the point is that it is not the possessions and the positions that require, but the contentment of being a true servant leader. This, of course, equal with God. The Son of God, he could do miracles. And we know his life story. As his primary role was to serve others. There are so many examples of how he did that. He served the sick, and he would go in and heal the sick and raise the dead, and he would set captives free, as it points out in his manifesto, as it were. He had come that he might liberate those who are bound, and not only physically, but spiritually as well, bound by sin, bound by those who are depraved. And he was bringing hope to a hopeless society when he came to this world. You're blessed when you worked up a good appetite for God. He is food and drink in the best meal you ever eat. So, how do you create an appetite for God? How do you develop that? In the same way that trust that you have a healthy appetite for good food and drink. Same way to acquire an appetite for intimacy with God. It is out of that kind of relationship that you are enabled and empowered and instructed how to be truly a servant leader. And you're blessed when you care. The moment you care, you find yourself cared for. And so it has a way to come back to you as you care for others, as you extend yourself, as you give out what has been given to you to others. Scripture promises to come back in so many more ways because you express that care and servanthood, and you commit to the lives of others in terms of demonstrating what it means to be a person who cares and goes the extra mile to look out for the needs of others. And you're blessed when you care. And then you're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. So the inner heart has to be in the right place. It has to be truly connected to God Himself, so that motivations and thoughts and actions and plans and strategies and all those good things has to be located out in a relationship that only comes from knowing God. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. And how do you help others to cooperate instead of competing? And we had discussed some lessons like on this topic before. It's not competing, but it's completing others.
Yes.
And we live in a very competitive world, and we tend to want to be, one step ahead of somebody else, so get them out of a place, or you know, so it creates conflict and confusion. But the role of a true servant leader is to cooperate, find ways to invest and resource others so that they understand these principles of servanthood and servant leadership, so that they too can learn these principles and pass it on to others. Because that's what Christ said to his disciples. He says, look, I have done this, I have demonstrated, I've taught you this, I've modeled it for you. I have showed you an example how to do this servanthood concept. Now you go and do it to others. And that's the way we learn. If we are just getting a lot of head knowledge, a lot of information, a lot of leadership principles, that's wonderful. But if we are not doing anything with it, then we are really back to square one. So it's how do we put into practice the things that are given to us, and the things that are shared, the concepts, the principles that others have worked hard to put the concepts and principles together, and makes it easier for us to communicate them. The original writers and thinkers and strategists taking biblical principles and making them easy for us to understand and to communicate. In the same way, we must continue this process. The things you have heard from faithful men, pass them on to others who also will pass them on to others. So it's a cycle of continuity where it does not stop with you or stop with us, but rather it continues to other generation. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. Now that's not an easy pill to swallow.
Not at all.
Yeah. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. Blessed are they who are persecuted for my name's sake. Yes. We avoid that one. We kind of tried. We don't want to be blessed in that way. We would take all the other blessings.
True.
But If we could skip this one, we'll go on to the next one.
I
Yes, but
heard
they
of
are
that.
some
Mhm.
principles. Yes.
Mhm. There was one person, I heard them put it this way: Mary was called blessed and highly favored above all women, and everything she experienced thereafter was not such a blessing, but it is favor. We wouldn't see it as that, but she was called that way, blessed and highly favored. So we might only see favor and blessing as a smooth sailing, as this point suggests so strongly. But it could be rough at times as a blessed person.
Right, but you also remember that the example of Mary is that, as was prophesied,
Yes.
the sword that pierced his son will be almost like piercing her own heart,
Mhm.
because she will experience the joy of giving
Yes.
birth to Christ, but
Okay.
also to be at the cross
Mhm.
to experience the pain and the anguish of soul,
Mhm.
spirit, to see her son
Mhm.
being crucified. So that's part of it. Persecution has a way to propel us out of our comfort zone, though, and we don't like that. But you remember in the early church the concept of where they felt comfortable staying in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and when the persecution came, when Saul and others started to persecute the church, they started to move out into other districts. And
Right.
that's how the message of Christ got out.
Mhm.
Persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom.
Hmm.
Um, the churches have gone through persecutions far greater in other countries than in these islands in the Caribbean. When you read the church history of the church that suffered in Korea, in South Korea,
Mhm.
from North Korea, and the war, and the church was burned down and people were killed and persecuted. Today, the Church of Korea, it has the largest single congregation in the world, as far as
Wow.
we know.
That's
Uh,
amazing.
yes,
Mhm.
and they have sent. I believe that the statistics is that they have more missionaries sent out into the world from that nation today, and a church and country, a nation that was so much persecuted. We
Yeah.
see that even in China today, where the church has been so much persecuted, but the rate of Christianity is growing so much faster
You're right.
in that nation. We do not know the exact population of
Mhm.
Christians who live in China. Out of the billion people that live there, there are millions of Christians in that country, under severe persecution and pressure. And so there's a sense of growth even in the midst. So the question to ask ourselves in these peaceful little islands where we are so comfortable and everybody's, nice and to us even, what would it take for us to get out of our comfort zone?
True.
Would God have to do something to us as a people to- for us to get the message, as we would say? What would it take for us as a people in these islands to really get and do what we ought to do, what we're called to do? And so those are the concepts that we have to work with. And as the Beatitudes in the form of personal discipline, intentionality, admit your need for God, be a person of brokenness before God, give up your quest for personal rights, maintain a hunger and thirst for God, practice an identity with people in need, do not isolate yourself from needy people, maintain a pure heart, blessed are the pure in heart, for they are the ones that will see God, cultivate peace in all relationships,
Mhm.
take a positive view of criticism. So sometimes we do not like when people criticize it, but there's always a way to handle that question. What blessing do you enjoy because of a decision to be a servant leader? And then number 8, the last point for our discussion this evening, live their lives opposite the philosophy of the world. Um, so it is a concept that is opposed to the philosophy of the world's mindset. And the world says, no, show yourself,
Mm-hmm.
pull your weight,
Mm-hmm.
boss people around,
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
Mm.
Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourself long enough to lend a helping hand. Philippians 2,
Mm-hmm.
3 to 4. Don't think relation says than you ought to think. Better than yourself. Um, so there are some paradoxes quickly. If I want to save my life, I must lose it. And with the philosophy of the world, if I want to be lifted up, I need to humble myself. If I want to be the greatest, be a servant. If I want to be first, be last. If I want to rule, I need to serve. If I want to live, I need to put to death the flesh and ourselves, its ambitions. If I want to be strong, we need to become weak and rely upon God. If I want to inherit the kingdom, we have to be poor in spirit. If I want to reproduce, I must die. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it cannot bear fruit. There's 7 parts to power. And force, people have no choice. Intimidation, people are pushed. And manipulation, people are coerced. Change, people trained for something. Honor, people are honored by the leader and they respond accordingly. So the question for application, who is someone you find difficult to serve? List 2 ways you can serve them this week. So those are some practical things we can set out to do, to deliberately find someone that is in a particular need and serve that person from a servanthood perspective. And that takes time, observation, concern for others. And there's that sense of fulfillment you go out this week that perhaps you have not even noticed in your past, um, in your sphere of work. It could be people within our own church that we have overlooked and not responded to a particular need. Perhaps children in our community are needy, the elderly, uh, those who cannot really help themselves. How do we find a way, deliberately, intentionally, to serve someone this week?
And as we have been, looking up for the past few moments, we've been talking about servant leadership, the art of the basin and the towel. And indeed, it points out that we have to really put aside the philosophies of the world and be transformed, or let our mind be renewed as to what it really takes to be a true leader in the kingdom of God. We have to put away a lot of our selfish ideals and selfish goals and really see people, see the need to help someone. One of the paradoxes you just read out, if you want to inherit the kingdom, be poor in spirit. If you want to be lifted up, humble ourselves. You want to be the greatest, be a servant, and it sounds just like a business, something you've learned in business. You look for a problem, you look for a need, and you meet it. And that's how you become valuable. You add value. And so we're encouraged to be servant leaders, to be aware, of course, of the temptations to, to show off our power, as Reverend John will have pointed out earlier. But we'll be tempted in those areas, but as Christ set out the pattern, so we are to follow and be followers of our greatest exemplar, Jesus, the greatest servant leader. Any final words before we pull down the curtains for today, Reverend John?
Right. So, from other writings, of course, and other principles, the biblical concept that the way up is down. Yes, the way up is down is a paradox as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be a good leader, you have to be a servant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the models of leadership. To be a great leader,
Mm-hmm.
it calls us to be servant in the true sense of the word.
All right. So we want to thank each and every one of our listeners for listening today. And we look forward to being with you another time. We encourage you to keep it locked to Hope 103 FM. God bless you and enjoy the balance of your Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
103.1 FM, reaching our nation for God.